Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the SDGs and Youth Making Connections for Progress. This is our monthly webinar from the International School for Development Justice. I'm so glad that you have joined us. I'm Dr. Laura Pilgrim, and I'm going to be your host for today. Today's topic is Empowering the Future, Advancing Global Quality Education, and it's going to be presented by Dr. Laurette Bristol. But first, we're just going to watch a short ad. The International School for Development Justice at UWI presents the SDGs and You, Making Connections for Progress webinar series. Starting September 17th and continuing on every third Wednesday of the month, we explore the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, what they are, their impact on Caribbean people, and the progress and challenges we face. Join us for 12 dynamic sessions with local and global experts. Ask questions, share your story, and make connections for progress. The SDGs and You webinar series. Register today. So currently, Dr. Laurette Bristol is the director for the School of Education and also chair of the Caribbean Joint Board of Teacher Education at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill Campus, Barbados. She has over 3 decades of service in education, teacher education, education administration, and education policy in the Caribbean and internationally. For 5 years, Dr. Bristol served as the program manager, Human Resource Development at the Caribbean Community CARICOM Secretariat Headquarters in Guyana. Dr. Bristol is also a narrative researcher and post-colonial scholar with over 40 peer-reviewed, single-authored, and co-authored books, book chapters, and journal articles. Her research emphasizes the historical impact of the colonial experience on classroom practices, prefiguring post-colonial educational aspirations and actions. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Laurette Bristol.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you so much for this opportunity, Dr. Pilgrim. And this is supposed to be an interactive session, so I'm going to try my best to ensure that it is an interactive session that we are going to be engaging with as you come along with me in a consideration of SDG 4 and where we are and how we have been traveling in the Caribbean. It will be great, colleagues, as we engage with each other, if you could introduce yourself. If you have not yet done so, I'd ask you to put in the chat who you are, your country, your institution that you're representing. And I will ask you to do something again in the chat in a little bit. We want to use that information towards the end of the session. So it's not my plan here today to preach to you in any way at all, but ready to create the opportunity for us together to think a little bit differently about what we know and feel about quality education. We have been engaged in our conversation for a pretty long time. Since 2017, region and internationally, we've been asking these questions about what makes a good education system, what makes a quality educational experience. We've been asking questions about how is what we're doing for the good of our society, the good of our community? How do we package a set of experiences or address a set of systematic issues so that we ensure that individuals can create worthwhile worlds for themselves, contribute to the worthwhile development of their communities, and advance and accelerate into global international arenas. So I will start off then with a repositioning of what it means to reimagine education in the Caribbean is not enough. What we need, colleagues, is a repositioning of education moving from a theoretical endeavor to more specific actions that enable and sustain quality education. I am going to take the position that reimagining is just the start. And we are now 4 years away from the arrival of 2013. And therefore, we need to be more comprehensively working towards action frameworks. We are already, in some sense, too late, to my view, given that in the Caribbean in 2024, according to the World Bank, only 4.9% of our students passed 5 or more CSEC subjects. And for those of you not from the region, and these CSEC subjects includes mathematics and English. For those of you not from the region, CSEC is a secondary school exit examination that really tells us whether or not a young person is ready to move on to either advanced learning through higher education or they're ready to enter the world of work. So we have to ask questions about this result. Is this a crisis of foundational learning and social development, or is this an emergency linked to the absence of more coherent and sustainable actions to support those enablers for governance, resourcing, effective leading, and pedagogy and relevant training? This is a question that we all have to think about together as we reflect on regional and international and national efforts to transform and lift education up as a driver for economic and civil development. So before we begin, in the chat, please indicate a response to this question. What does quality education mean for you? And I'll ask Laura to also put that question in the chat so that for persons who are coming into the session late, they can respond to that question. And really, as we are engaging, as we're talking, if your perspective is shifting and changing, that's fine. Just respond to the question for you, where you are. What does quality education mean to you? I'm going to ask a colleague of mine who's in this space to compile all those results and put it into Gemini AI, and we'll see what graphic is created at the end. I am going to declare now as well that a lot of the implications for what we're talking about has implications for technology and the use of AI. So I am declaring now that I actually created slides and then asked AI for help with designing the slides. So I'm putting that on a table there for you. So let's get into this conversation. When we think about SDG 4, SDG 4 goes beyond simply increasing school enrollment rates. I think we can all agree on that. It focuses on quality, inclusivity, relevance across all stages of life, from birth to death. So it is around lifelong learning. So we see in the region, there is strong regional alignment with the CARICOM Human Resource Development 2030 strategy. And Dr. Pilgrim indicated that for a significant portion of my life, I had responsibility for supporting the region in translating and implementing the intentions and goals of the CHRD 2030 strategy into actionable efforts. The CHRD 2030 strategy was launched in 2017. And of course, it focuses on increasing access and participation, quality, equity, and relevance. And it's all engineered towards unlocking the human potential in the Caribbean. We also see alignment with the SDG goals and SDG 4 in particular with the OECS Education Sector Strategy 2012 to 26 through its focus on relevance, efficiency, effectiveness, impact, and importantly, sustainability. And of course, for those of you who are paying attention, you know that the language within the OECS is changing from sustainability to regeneration because we recognize that sustainability goes so far. But what we need to do is begin to think about regeneration. And we have to think about the notion of regeneration in the context of conversations around SDG 4 and the particular targets and indicators as well. So in the Caribbean, when we think about what quality education means for us, these are some of the concepts and practices that we must engage with, whether we are teachers, we are learners, we are recent graduates, whether we are education policy developers, education leaders, we must contend. But what do we mean when we talk about quality, inclusivity, relevance? If it is that we're in the Caribbean, CARICOM, OECS, what are we talking about when we're talking about increasing access and participation? What are we talking about when we talk about enhancing the efficiency and effectiveness and impact of our education systems? So it's well known by now that SDG 4 has 10 targets, which essentially positions education as the heart of any social and economic, political, technological, and environmental transformation agenda. Importantly, it maintains access and participation as a foundational and empowering human right, and it calls into force the obligations of the state to ensure, and I like to say ensure, quality and relevant education as a public good, while also advancing inclusivity and equity. So what do we know about the progress of SDG 4 in the Caribbean? Those of us who are paying attention, you know that we have been articulating the areas of acceleration needed, the areas where we are identifying as stagnation, etc., in regional and international efforts. But for the purposes of this presentation, I want to only focus on 4.1, 4.2, 4.6, 4.7, and 4A and C. I just want to inform as well that I am aware that 4.3 expands the scope of the international education agenda by including technical and vocational education training, TVET, and tertiary education as central concepts. Whereas 4.4 emphasizes the importance of equipping our youth and adults with the essential skills that they need for employment and entrepreneurship and decent work. And 4.5 mandates that we eliminate gender disparities in education and ensuring equal access for vulnerable populations. It is not to suggest that these are not important, but I think importantly, understanding the state of play for these targets in relation to the Caribbean is critical. But in the Caribbean, these are also defined by the complexity of our jurisdictional dynamics and macroeconomic realities. So it's uniquely challenging to make a more comprehensive statement about these, even though I will be speaking to some of them as I go through my presentation. And the reality, though, is that the evidence on progress in and of itself, the fact that we can't make comprehensive statements about these targets, is potentially evidence about our progress. So I believe that 4.1, 4.2, 4.6, 4.7, 4A and C, I call them our engine targets. They provide a foundational basis for progress against the other targets, which may not be more explicitly addressed in this presentation. So target 4.1, we recognize by 2030, we want to ensure that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to the relevant and effective learning outcomes. So where are we in relation to that? For me, I think that from our location, we are in a consideration in Astoria paradox. Target 4.1 is the story that we know what the problem is. We know that yes, we have universal primary education, but we also know that we're struggling with retention and we're struggling with challenges around foundational literacy and numeracy. We know that we have almost universal secondary access to education, but we're also struggling with whether our system or selection processes to transition from primary into secondary. In many of our cases, it's high-stake competitive tests, which is very elite and often considered to be inequitable. We know of spaces like Barbados that's considering revising those primary exit examinations and coming up with a more democratic, decolonized, enabling form of supporting transition from primary into secondary school. We also know that our secondary school system suffers from inadequate resources, inadequate and inequitable allocation of resources, and it struggles from weak governance in many spaces. And of course, we know, and I'm going to keep coming back to the question of the boy problem, we know that we are experiencing high rates of repetition across the system for both males and females, but we're seeing some significant concerns for boys, which is raising questions about systemic inefficiencies. Because especially for our boys in the Caribbean, we know that boys and girls are entering primary school at almost similar rates, but we're seeing more boys falling out than we see more girls falling out. So the question is why and how this is happening. And colleagues, we cannot escape the persistent residues of our colonial legacy in education provision, which is affecting the way in which we deliver and govern, how we allocate resources, the kinds of policies that we develop, and the kind of practices that we are enabling. We have high-stake testing, which is still leaving 75 to 80% of our students behind in the region, and which results in 4.9% CSEC pass rates with 5 subjects. And of course, we know that when we talk about a pass, this is a 1, a 2, or 3. And if we try to break those figures down, the problem becomes even more challenging. So we do know that there are systemic and we do have some structural bottlenecks, which are facilitated through grade level national testing, primary exit placement examinations, the rates of students reaching upper secondary school after many periods of repetition, and then some instances we just move them on. So we are not necessarily matching the number of students who are in our education system, who are entering, and then who are then being allowed to do the exit examination at the secondary level. And of course, these practices are enabling, unfortunately, some persistent gender, socioeconomic, and geographical inequalities in our educational outcomes. So when I talk about 4.1 being a story of paradox, we are constantly in this battle between fiscal strain, even though we are seeing progress, So we are seeing progress, but that progress is always compromised by decisions around that fiscal strain, the decolonial or globalized aspirations that we are intended to, even while we navigate realities that affect us that we have no control, such as the pandemic, the hurricane impacts, etc., that creates opportunities for stagnation in our system. When we think about 4.2, by 2030, ensure that all girls and boys have access to quality and early childhood development, KM, pre-primary education, so that they are ready for primary education. And this is interesting because while we have universal access to primary, we are not at universal access as yet to pre-primary education. A number of our territories are making significant inroads in this and making significant investment. But this again becomes a point of contestation that we have to ask questions about. Why does this matter? Why does it matter that we make significant investments in pre-primary education? Well, we see the deficiencies in access to quality stimulation during the 0 to 2 year period. And we know the data tells us that the earlier a child is stimulated and the earlier a child is allowed to create those neurons, these connections between those neurons, for the brain to become much more flexible and adaptive. The earlier that happens, the better the outcomes for the student, for the child. But because that is not necessarily happening across the board in an equitable manner for all children, there are significant challenges with the financing of early childhood education. Parents who are impoverished are not able to send their child into those early stimulation opportunities, and governments that are constrained may not have the ability to create the opportunities to give access to those who cannot afford without government support. So there definitely needs to be an enhancement and a strengthening of our early childhood services and workforce skills. So it's not just about the provision of early stimulation and pre-primary, good solid pre-primary experiences. It's also about ensuring that those persons who are in that sector are providing support at the pre-primary level. They're also properly trained to be able to provide that early stimulation that is needed for the primary school. A UNICEF report in 2023 suggests that on average, students who participated in preschool education scored 28 points higher than those who did not. So we know it's important. It's important. We know that monitoring and maintaining quality is a challenge, even while we consider some of the friction points that exist between policy funding, resources, and pedagogy. And we can delve deeper into the concerns and questions about early childhood teachers and the way in which their conditions of employment are designed, and the professionalization of the whole force of that particular subgroup within the teaching profession. We can talk more about that as we go forward. So therefore, why does it matter? Well, it matters because it supports improved brightness. It matters because it requires consistent investment, and it matters because strengthened policy is needed to ensure that we provide those early stimulation opportunities for our children of that age group across the board. So, 4.6, by 2030, we want to ensure that all youth and a substantial portion of our adults, both males and females, achieve literacy and numeracy. I look at this and I smile because if we are not attending to the early childhood, we're having problems with the transition between primary into secondary. And then on the exit of secondary, you see where we're going? So until we start to pay attention in a different way and be more deliberate around our actions, we're going to find that we ourselves continue to build into our system the things that are creating our failure. So we need to pay attention differently, which is why I'm saying it's not just about reimagining. It's about how do we then take the data that we have and transform and change the actions that we are engaged in. So where are we in terms of target 4.6? Well, I believe that target 4.6 flags in a way that has not been flagged before our vulnerability challenge. We have high dropouts The question is what's happening to the boys. I tell you, I'll keep coming back to that. We still have concerns with teacher training and teaching strategies, which are very teacher centered and not as active and learner focused as we want that to be. So we have learners in classrooms who are being called to be passive engagers and not active engagers within, they're not being called to be producers of information. We still have too many approaches being used that are calling our students to be consumers of information. And of course, if we are talking about the systematic issue, imagine the transformation as a 100-meter dash where we are now. And of course, we're trying to build this plane while flying it. And in the engagement of the system transformation, we're seeing that the frenzy and the fatigue that is emerging as we think about it. So the participation of boys and males in education clearly is a concern for us in the Caribbean, given increasing systematic vulnerabilities that our males in education are facing, not just in education, but also colleagues in social participation, even while we recognize that that contradicts what we see happening in the labor market, where the boys and the males appear to have more opportunities in the labor force, as we're not seeing that parity in the labor force as we would want to see it between males and females. So depending upon the sector, we see the reality manifesting differently for the genders. But we are also being asked now to consider more closely as teachers, how do we navigate gender sensitive teaching and curriculum to reform education and close participation gaps in education. We want to talk about labor for education and labor access for all boys and girls across ethnicity, geography, and socioeconomic status. And many, as I indicated before, of our Caribbean territories are caught up in this frenzy of education reform. And colleagues, I want to support that and celebrate. I think it's good. But stakeholders are also now beginning to complain about reform fatigue. Too much change too fast. The caution is that the rate and pace of change must also then be culturally responsive. Otherwise, education change could become another source of exclusion for persons in the Caribbean who get left behind, given that they could not change fast enough. So I want us to take a pause and to reflect. And I would want us, for those of you yet who have not yet put in the chat your thoughts about education quality and what it means for you. I want us to open the mic a bit and have two persons indicate for us, based upon where I am now in the presentation, how are you beginning to conceptualize or make sense of what quality education means? So I'll pause for a minute and just ask two persons, and I'll ask Dr. Pilgrim to help me identify those, because I won't see the hands because I'm sharing screen, of persons who wish to share their contribution of what quality education means for you where you are now. So we'll pause, take a breath and pause for a minute. I see somebody put their hand up before they wait. I think you're Wandy Lewis. Go ahead, you're Wandy.
Yes. Yep. There are two responses or three to the question of what is quality education
Thanks. I
in
can't
the
see
chat.
that. I can't
Yes,
see.
Yeah,
they are,
man.
but not to the question she's asking right now.
Okay, what's the question right
So
now?
based
I
upon
missed that.
Thanks, Wendy. Based upon where we are now in the presentation, how are your thoughts changing? Are you experiencing any, as you reflect upon what quality education means, how are you making sense of it given the challenges that the region has been confronted? And what is it?
Well, that's a big question, and I'm processing. So, I'm not sure I'm going to answer the question you're asking, but based on what you have shared, I thought about, as you said, the fatigue that some of us may have due to um the constant transformation of the education system. That is something I hadn't thought about. And then the second thing is that how do you, in that transformation, preserve quality? I was thinking about Jamaica. Is the challenge to, for example, transform the primary exit exam that's PEP in Jamaica or C in Trinidad, or
Barbados,
okay, in Barbados as well, or do you build more schools and train more teachers? Because there's a sense in which no matter how you change the exam, the issue really is that there are just not enough quality schools. So there are schools, but not enough quality schools. Because and let me just stop here so I can give other persons a chance. I'll end there. Thanks.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept that you're introducing. So is the question that we have to take on in the Caribbean a question of quality education, or is it a question of quality schools? And if we're saying quality schools, then what do we mean by quality schools? I mean, colleagues, if you don't want to open your mic, we could have this discussion in the chat with each other, and you can engage with each other. So are we asking then a question when we think about SDG 4 and what it means for us from the question of quality? Are we talking about quality education or quality schools? That's an important thing that we have to figure out and we have to work on. I think we also need to come to some consensus in the Caribbean about what we mean when we're talking about quality. Quality what? Quality for whom? Quality where? I would open the mic for one more person to make an intervention before we go on. And I should say quality how as well. That matters. One more person. Don't be shy. We're all troubling the same questions together.
Hi, Dr. Crystal.
Go
Yes,
ahead,
please.
Andrea.
Hi, this is Andrea Burnett. So, when I responded to the question about quality education, I think that my initial thoughts are quite narrow, up to the secondary level. And then when you talked about the adult education and making sure that adults are numerate and literate, I think that widened my view of what quality education should be. It should not just be from 0 to 18, but it should be a continuous process. The same way we have professional development for teachers, there should also be a arena where adults are constantly learning, and there should be systems in place to help those who may be behind. And therefore, we have to look at the how we cater to adults and their experiences and what they bring to the learning space, because we might have persons that have the prior learning experience, but they might not have the formal education, but they do have experience and knowledge and expertise based on what careers or what we might not call it careers because they might not be professional in the sense of how we look at professional, but they might be a janitor somewhere that interacts with children at school or in a hospitality setting where he interacts with the tourists and so on. And he has been learning constantly. And how do we cater to those people, recognizing that they have been learning, and how do we provide opportunities for them to expand their learning more?
Yeah,
So
thanks for that, Andrea. But you also make me think about something that we don't talk about often in times when we talk about quality. A lot of times when we talk about quality, we talk about quality and it's linked to qualifications. You see, there's almost this
yes.
equivalency conversation that's happening when we're talking about quality, we're talking about qualifications and the quality of the qualifications. But we're not necessarily always explicitly talking about quality from the position of the nature of the human being. Who is this human being? And how
Right.
this person then build quality relationships with the people that they come into contact with. We don't talk enough about the soft skills. You know, are you empathetic? Do you have the capacity for critical thinking? Do you have a curiosity mindset? Are you engaging in creative endeavors when you're confronted with a problem? Do you just shut down, give up, and sit down and wait for somebody to solve the problem for you? Or are you able to take the data that you are gathering through your lived experience and bringing it to bear to apply to solutions to the problems that you're encountering? Ronnie, I see your hand up. I'm going to take you last, and then we're going to keep moving. Go ahead, Ronnie.
Thank you and good afternoon, colleagues. Sorry I joined a little late, but I got sufficient from you, Doc. I have been reflecting this since my Jamaica days. And when I came across the Brazilian activists and so on, Paulo Freire, who talks about education as conscientization. And I have sort of taken that to heart, and especially in light of the fact when we look at the social vulnerable aspects of each of our societies, and I'm specifically talking about the crime situation, Barbados, Trinidad, Jamaica, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Grenada and Antigua seem to be doing reasonably well in terms of keeping down those numbers, and I wonder what different they are doing. But I agree with you that I am also expanding education to mean the quality of engagement that citizens have with each other and with persons who choose to live in our space. And I and when I look at each of our systems, we have made progress, yes, significant progress, but yet in an age where information is rampant and readily available, and there are various means for engagement, there seem to be a retreat in terms of the quality citizen that we saw, at least our founders, our mothers and fathers of 50, 60 years ago. And if you want to go back to the 1930s, that was their
Mm.
that is what they were fighting for. But we seem to have retrogressed. The sort of a crimes that are committed that we commit on each other is just astounding, you know. So I throw that in the mix because I'm moving away from seeing education as something that we simply pass exams and yes, we have a certificate, but more of the social person, that mind and attitude and the skills that make for a decent society and a decent human being. So I just wanted to throw that in as well and say I
No,
agree with what you said
thanks
there.
for that. Again, that speaks to some of the silent areas that are not necessarily loud enough. They're the byproducts. When you read the papers and you read the publications and the research, whether it's great, whatever type of material that you're reading, they're very loud on the question of the things that we can tick off, the things that we can count. Yeah. But they're not as loud on the question of the things that we can feel and experience when we think about the question of quality education. And both you and Andrea flagged not just the human element of it, but the sociality of quality. So when we're talking about quality education, it's not just about the quality of the individual as a result of a package of learning experiences through a carefully designed curricular engagement, considering both the enacted, the hidden, the null, all the other different types of curriculum, but also, and who's that individual who's graduating from our schools? But then, how does that individual can go on to live? What quality of life is being created? Well, and it becomes an important question because as someone said, and I can't remember the name of the person who said it, we don't send people to school to get a qualification. People go to school to gain knowledge that they need to solve the problems of their present and the future. And if we are not generating and regenerating habits and practices where our children and ourselves, our colleagues are engaging in this education endeavor, where we are gathering information, not just for qualification, but gathering information to change who we are and how we understand ourselves, how we understand ourselves in relation to the other, and the other meaning the persons that we live in our families, in our homes, in our workspaces, in our communities, and therefore how do we collectively work with each other to solve the problems that we are confronting. And those problems are political, they're social, they're economical, and they're environmental, and they're also technological. If that is not the end game, then what is the end game when we're thinking about the question of quality education? And oftentimes the issues that we have just been discussing, they're the soft ones, they're the silent ones. We don't talk about it as much. And I'm hoping that when we come out of this engagement, we're finding that we need to shift the conversation. Yes, not just in terms of how we talk about it, but then how do we go on to live in this world to create this world that we consider to be worth living in. And I think that these are the things that we have been talking about. So let's keep moving. So we want to look at target 4.7. Yeah, and we want to ensure that all learners, and this is like what we're talking about, have the skills needed to promote sustainable development, including amongst others through education for sustainable development, sustainable lifestyle, human rights. We're talking about culture, peace, nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of other cultural diversities, etc. This is the world worth living that we're talking about. And of course, in this world worth living, the Caribbean is in a unique position. We are on the front line of climate change. We all agree that we don't necessarily contribute the most, but we get the most effects. It makes, therefore, ESD an interesting challenge for us in the Caribbean, given that it's tied up with nurturing, as Ronnie and Andrea and Yawandi, you were saying, the whole person living in, for us in the Caribbean, climate and socially vulnerable times. So for us in the Caribbean, ESD often though suffers from trials that affect equity. I've been talking about it. They're further compounded given that climate change impacts are disrupting our schools. And in some cases, as we have seen recently in the impact in Jamaica, where we are resetting education gains. It's almost as though Jamaica was divided in half. One half of Jamaica continued along, after the rain stopped. Another half lost significant infrastructure and they had to restart over. Records for students missing, and how do we navigate that reality, and how do we pay attention to that so that we are looking to accelerate based upon the reset that we have experienced. And of course, we know that our young people are complaining. They're complaining to us and telling us, listen, this thing that you're teaching us in school have no relevance to us. Why we have to learn this? We know that our teachers are complaining. Our teachers are telling us the teacher education that we're getting is not necessarily preparing us for the realities and the complexities of the classrooms that we're confronting. Ronnie, you talked about violence, and we see the way the violence is now, it's not creeping into our classrooms anymore. It's there. That's where we are now. So teachers have to begin to get particular kinds of skills that they need to address the reality of the complex learner that is coming in front of them. And of course, while we're navigating, the young people who are engaged are complaining about the relevance of the curriculum. We're navigating, or the teachers who are still committed are complaining that, we need more support, training, development. We're also navigating realities around marginalized groups that are existing within context of limited infrastructure. The question is, do we need to build more schools? And then what do we need to see inside of those schools in terms of infrastructure to know that we are giving every single learner, every single teacher adequate opportunity to equitably engage in the endeavor of learning for living, right? So we are navigating the question of the infrastructure, and we know some schools have the resources to get more, some not as much. And we also have to navigate this shift where we are looking to view education as context specific and transformative. How are we doing all of that while navigating the challenges that we're confronting? And on the curriculum level, we're also dealing with questions around mainstreaming ESD. I am part of a group of persons who are supporting a project on integrating ESD into the curriculum. And one of these things that we have recognized is that there's some natural science silos where we think ESD could only be in science, geography, etc. And we have to begin to move away from that to be thinking about ESD principles and how do we then integrate those as well as content through collaboration, critical thinking, systems thinking across the curriculum. And if we're thinking about creating an education system that not only provides people a qualification, but provides a person with a collection of experiences that help them to become better human beings, who are then provided with the skills needed to respond to the social, political, technological challenges, environmental challenges that they come into confrontation with. Then education for sustainable development, climate change education, disaster risk reduction, if we want to confront that properly to provide an inclusive and equitable landscape, we are now beginning to talk about enhanced resources to support the learning workforce and entrepreneurial transitions. We're now talking about empowering teachers in a different way. We're talking about significantly, if we want to empower teachers, we need to modify teacher education. And we must ensure that we have a climate resilient education infrastructure. So this question about what is quality education for us in the Caribbean is not something that we take for granted. It's not an easy response answer. And if we look at target 4.4a, we're talking about the facilities, exactly what that we were talking about. And this takes us directly to concerns around how do we design an education ecosystem that is coherent, open, and adaptable. It talks about, so we have to recognize too, let me pause, we have been making some advances in the Caribbean. We have the conversations around the Caribbean Safe School Initiative, the Caribbean New School Model. We have a lot of work that we have been doing in the Caribbean. And these frameworks, however, as beautifully as they are, appear to me to seem to be operating still too much as epistemic intellectual frameworks. And that's good. We are really good in the Caribbean at designing good policy. But how do we move then from the intellectual framework to the operationalization? What are the policies? What are the strategies? What are resource frameworks that we are now moving towards? And I know, colleagues, I will own, I recognize that a lot of this is dependent upon donor funding. A lot of it is dependent upon when the donor funding starts, when the donor funding stops. And oftentimes the political will, because we know that when the donor funding ends, the project ends, they die. You know, we have this great collection of products that doesn't go anywhere, doesn't serve anyone. We have to shift away from those realities. And as for us, particularly in higher education, when we begin to collaborate with our colleagues across the region and internationally to design public goods for educational systems, we have to design it with regenerative capacities inbuilt. It's not just sustainability plans. What happens after the funding is over? Who do we need to engage in a political directorate to ensure that resources, if this thing is good, then it should be good for everybody and it should be good forever. So how do we engage the political directorate to ensure that there's always funding to do work that we know is good? Or does that work end when the funding ends? It's the dependency framework that is also a part of our colonial past that continues to rear its head even as we aspire towards a post-independent, and now people will tell you it's not just post-independent, a post-colonial decolonized notion and framing of our education systems. This is something that we are challenged with on a regular basis. How do we do that to respond to the lived realities of where we are today? And of course, in order to do that, you know, a lot of times we see the teachers as the drivers, and SDG4 operating then across all these targets where we see teachers are positioned as the heartbeat. That's how I like to see it, because we see SDG4 as the engine, but if SDG4 is the engine, and I like to say teachers are the heartbeat, then the car can't go nowhere if it ain't have no gas. So the teachers are the gas, is the gas for this system. And I see myself as a teacher, no matter where I am, when I'm policy, teacher education, administration, I believe that I'm a teacher. And we are confronting as teachers a new landscape that is highly transactional, and it's sometimes eating at the soul of who we are and what we do. So SDG4 calls us to guard against that. We know that when we are confronting the conversation about teacher professionalism, we had the debate a couple of years ago in Jamaica, and we saw the tensions between the conversation at council or commission versus council, and the concerns and the worries that emerge as it relates to that. We know that we are continuously experiencing in the region high teacher turnover. But we also know in relation to where we are that we need to now confront new codes of ethics and morals and conducts. We're not living in the same space. We have a technology mediated space with AI, and I drew on AI a lot to develop some of these slides. AI navigating, but we also see the danger in the AI where we are seeing that children and people are developing relationships with AI more than developing relationships with each other. So we have this new transactionalism that is in teacher education that is shifting what we do. We're going from what we want is to move from transmission, this unilateral, and I think, Ron, you talked about Freire conscientization, the banking model of education, to more interaction and engagement, empathy, humanity, care, teachers as cultural workers, where we care for each other around co-creation, participatory realities, where rather than take the approach of education as corporate, because corporate is tick box and cost-effective enterprises. These are all important when we think about financial constraints. But if we go too far, we lose the humanity of what we're doing. And therefore, it's important for us in the Caribbean, if we really want to be committed to post-independence, post-colonial, decolonized notions of education, that we begin to really think about what are the sets of multiple knowledges we are drawing on, and the shift in positionalities that we need to be paying attention to as we give form to the society that we want to live in when we are all retired and we are in our rocking chairs. I talk about to my colleagues all the time that I know where I am now, but I look forward to the day where I'm sitting on my porch and I'm rocking and watching my world go by and saying, okay, Lord, you have done what you could do to the best of your ability, and you did well, because I'm seeing the results through the engagements I have with former students, etc. If we want that, then we all have to be working towards that collectively. And as I begin to wrap up, I will admit, as I said before, that I use Gemini AI to create some of these graphics. So this graphic is important. It's one of the last two slides that I have. We've been talking about all this. So then what then is the implication for Caribbean learning standards and SDG 4 project progress? Well, I will tell you that in the context of regional agendas, all of us are very sensitized to what's happening with us in conversations on CARICOM in particular, and the CARICOM single market economy. This regenerative success of CSME then, colleagues, is heavily dependent upon the nature and form of educational experiences we provide for economic partnership and innovation. Education reform, not just across basic education, but inclusive of TVET and higher education, to enable equitable, inclusive, quality education delivery, adapted to respond to AI literacy and ethics, and moving towards a more decolonized and developmental education system. So we're not leaving anybody behind. Cultural curriculum learning standards must be reviewed and revised to support the integration of climate change and disaster risk reduction, to move us away from the hegemony that we have right now of discipline silos towards more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary collaborations. Teacher education reform has to happen. It has to become more gender sensitive. It has to become trauma informed pedagogies and forms of assessment, culturally relevant and responsive forms of assessments, where teachers are now able to draw on the principles of effective pedagogical practices to design what we know are more authentic assessment learning experiences. We have to move away from the content and focus on what are the skills that you need to learn, and how do I package my lesson as an experience of skills so that you begin to develop, continue to develop the skills that you need to have to solve the problems that you're facing now in your home realities and the problems you will face down the road. How do I package skills and competencies so that I'm not just ensuring that you are employable, but ensuring that you have employability and you are able to regenerate income through entrepreneurial endeavors? Are we focusing on that? Are we talking about ensuring that they're employable, or are we wanting to push for employability, which I think has more value? Because if I foster a human being who could go and get a walk, as we say in the Caribbean, then what happens if somebody pulls away funding? We've seen that happening in Trinidad in particular, with the potential exit of Nestles and the loss of jobs. What do these people do? Do they have the skills to go create economies of skills for themselves so that they can maintain themselves? So it's important then, as we think about this, that we engage seriously with the challenge of teacher professionalization, my apologies, the conditions of employment, autonomy, accountability. We have to engage that, because we really need the heartbeat to really gas, to really support us in moving from a focus of content to competencies and skills so that we have people in the Caribbean who are moving from being consumers to producers of knowledge. And I will talk more about this this is my last slide, that when we think then about SDG 4 in the Caribbean, we are being confronted with ongoing fundamental shifts in our epistemological framing, our ontological locations, the value systems that we have, and the particular strategies that we apply for the design of education delivery and research. And of course, it requires ongoing action along the way for intersubjectivity, where we now have to create new forms of partnerships between teachers, learners, teacher educators, policy leads, right? And we have to recognize leadership as the fundamental driver. So in no particular order, this is where we have to move from quality as an operational blueprint and not just an abstract consideration. We have to reconsider the importance of quality data and its impact on re-engineering education planning, classroom practices, and the conditions for work. We have to attend to the professionalization of the education labor force and support this with shifts in assessment practices, moving from high stakes to more equitable, democratic approaches to measure competency along the lifespan, and building referral pathways that are proactive and accessible to those who need the support. We have to make changes to the enabling conditions that are needed to build a close alignment between pedagogy and data, supporting movements away from dependencies on digital knowledge towards consumerism to advocacy around digital knowledge production for us in the Caribbean. We cannot run away from the technology, and we cannot retreat in the face of worries and concerns around AI. How do we use AI as a tool is always important rather than assume that AI is taking over our lives. So colleagues, SDG 4 cannot be an abstract concept. We are living not just in reimaginations, but we have to become actors and agents of the change that we want for the lived experience. We will not get it right at the first attempt, but we can regenerate it rightly through multiple points of engagement and, importantly, partnership. So if we are to go from aspiration to action, it really requires us to intentionally engage in the shifts in practices and the reallocation of resources. But it's important as well that we consider what are the mindsets we are navigating: quality data generation, management, and accountability, pedagogical re-engineering for professionalization, a realignment of our forms and practices of our assessments. And importantly, we need to build towards digital sovereignty in our schools, where we are now producers. Schools become producers of information and learning systems. Colleagues, with that, I say thank you, and I look forward to engaging with you as we go through this conversation. So Laura, I hand the floor back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bristol, for an engaging and interactive presentation. I think all of us learned a lot. I'm going to open the floor to Nisha Manik-Chan for a moment.
We'll share our graphic. Thanks, Nisha, for that. So colleagues, I mentioned my colleague Nisha, who's doing this in the background for me. So thanks. Let's take a look at that, and hopefully we can use this as the stimulus, Laura, for maybe one or two last interventions from our colleagues, if we have time.
We have 6 minutes. Please go ahead. Go ahead, Nisha.
So Nisha, if you can open up the screen a little bit more for us.
Yes.
So colleagues, take a minute, reflect. This is based upon your input in the chat. This is what we are saying quality education means for us. And I'm seeing that we are talking about it as an all-rounded framework: holistic development, student support and diverse learning styles, preparing for life and the working world, educator empowerment and system resources, and socioeconomic impact and community. And those are broken down. I want to pause here because I don't like the sound of my own voice all the time. And really want to create a space for 2 quick interventions. So persons who put their hands up, how are you responding to this? Have your views been changing? Has it been shifting in this very quick, hot 1-hour engagement? Does quality education mean the same thing you entered the session with? Or did it shift a little bit? If it shifted, how? this is what we are all seeing. I love this graphic. Thank you so much. So how are we responding? Talk to me, colleagues. One of the things that we have to move away from too is the shyness of keeping our opinions to ourselves. If we are going to be engaging in this question about what does quality education mean, then talk to us. Let's put all ideas on the table so that we can get this going together.
Sarah Edwards, thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting, this final graphic. I'm part of a group that's doing an education challenge for a course. And I had a bit of a fight to defend the relevance of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so it's really refreshing because I'm in an education cohort, and just to see how intersecting education is and the relevance of the Sustainable Development Goals. So it's really very heartening. This colleague of mine did not think that it was something worth including, and that it wasn't necessarily all that relevant. They saw the SDGs as abstract and looking more at vocational skills certification and skills certification, but they did not see the SDGs as necessarily a strong connection. And so this was really a very refreshing session to see that it is relevant and just how it connects and intersects. So thank you. And I think this graphic does a good job of that.
Thank you, Sarah. You're most welcome. Yewande, you're gonna wrap us up. Go ahead, Yewande.
Okay, thanks I agree with Thera. This graphic is really, it's quite powerful. I struggle. So it shifted a bit by thinking about something by mentioning rural. We tend to forget rural, so I'm glad the person who had mentioned that. And what I remembered, based on something that you said, the term that came to mind is situated practice. Yes, funding stops, but guess what? If the teachers on the ground believe in the idea, they'll continue it. And the last thing I'd say is that with the 2 back-to-back hurricanes that we've experienced in Jamaica, I think now is the time to really push this kind of education for sustainable development because it's fresh in our minds. I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yewande, and thank you, colleagues, for engaging with me, and Laura for extending the invitation for me to have a conversation with our colleagues about the way in which we've been thinking about education for sustainable development. Let's keep asking questions. Let's keep pushing the boundaries, because it cannot mean the same thing for all of us in the same spaces. It has to become situated. Laura, back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bristol. Another round of applause for her for an excellent presentation. And thank you to Nisha Manikchan for that lovely graphic. I also want to say that we need to consider including AI, because clearly AI created that. So that may be something we want to include in our discussion on quality education. For those of you who are interested in the next workshop, it's going to be on August 19th, and it will be on SDG 10, Reduced Inequalities. There is also a note in the chat about if you missed any of the sessions, you can find them. You can find them on the ISDJ YouTube channel. Thank you again, everyone, and I'm wishing you all a wonderful afternoon. Hope to see you at the next session. Bye-bye.